bowl slipped from her wet hands and shattered against the floorboards just as he entered the door without knocking, his hat still dripping rain. Neither of them moved for an instant. She looked at the white fragments scattered like small bones, and he looked at his trembling hands, and neither of them spoke of the real reason they were trembling. "I thought you were someone else," she finally said, bending to gather the pieces. "I know," he replied. "That's why I came in so fast." That was it. A sentence that meant nothing and meant everything, suspended in the humid kitchen air, while outside the spring storm battered the roof of the only decent house for 50 miles around. The woman's name was Eleanor Quinn, and she was 28, an age that in Briar Hollow Valley was already considered almost a sentence. Not due to illness or ugliness, she had a finely boned face and hazel eyes that the summer sun turned almost golden, but due to a habit she herself had forged with her own hands: saying no. At 16, she'd said no to a fur trader who smelled of old tobacco. At 20, she'd said no to a widower with 3 children and a prosperous farm. At 23, she'd said no to a young preacher who spoke of God as if he were a business contract. The town had stopped asking after the 3rd time, and she'd stopped explaining after the 1st. She lived alone since her father died of fever 2 winters ago, in a wooden house she repaired herself, with a garden she tended herself, and a fabric and sewing shop she managed herself, with a precision the other women in town called, depending on the day, admirable or suspicious. She didn't need anyone. That was the phrase she repeated, first to others, then just to herself, on nights when the silence of the house became a sound of its own. The man who had just broken the bowl was named Samuel Crane, and he had been living in Briar Hollow for barely 8 months. Enough time for people to stop calling him an outsider, but not enough for anyone to truly know who he was. He had arrived in autumn with a tired horse, a carpenter's toolbox, and an incomplete story about a farm to the east that no longer existed. He didn't talk about it. He worked with his hands from dawn until the light faded, repairing roofs, building fences, fixing what the previous winter had broken. And he guarded his silences with the same discipline with which he guarded his tools. Everything in its place, nothing explained unnecessarily. Eleanor knew him because he bought thread and leather from her to reinforce work gloves, and because, without being asked, he had fixed her back door hinge in October, the leak in her roof in November, and the loose wheel of her wagon in January, always without warning, always when she was in the shop and he knew she wouldn't be home to see him work. She would find the repairs done and never find the man. Until one afternoon, by a quirk of schedules, she found him kneeling by her well, adjusting the pulley, and he stood up so quickly he hit his head on the well's roof beam, and she laughed, a short, genuine laugh that surprised her more than him. "You didn't have to do this," she told him then, referring to the pulley, though they both knew she was talking about something broader. "I know," he replied, rubbing his head. "I wanted to." That was the first time she felt, somewhere below her sternum, something she didn't dare name. What neither of them had said aloud in the months that followed was both simple and immense. That she awaited his visits without admitting it, rearranging her work week around the days he usually passed by the shop. That he measured his arrival time in town by the light on in Eleanor's window, which he saw from the road he took each night, even if that road was the longer one. Neither asked the other about their past. Neither offered their own. It was a tacit agreement between two people who had learned, each in their own way, that asking too much was the first step to losing something. The winter months had turned the distance between their two houses, barely a quarter-mile of prairie, into a path worn by Samuel's boots, who found increasingly flimsy reasons to cross it. Once it was to return a needle she had never lent. Another time it was, he claimed, to warn her about wolves that no neighbor had seen. Eleanor began to make extra coffee, without saying for whom, and he began to appear just as the coffee was still warm, without saying how he knew. There was one February afternoon when she cut her finger sewing, and he, who was passing by, he always was, took her hand without asking permission and pressed it against a clean cloth, and for 5 full seconds neither of them withdrew their hand, even though the bleeding had already stopped. 5 seconds isn't a long time, but in a town where people knew each other by heart and gestures were read like open letters, 5 seconds was a declaration that both of them decided, separately, not to have heard. But what neither of them knew yet was that this winter would end up pushing them toward a decision neither had planned to make, and that spring would bring not only storms, but a question Eleanor had been avoiding answering for years. The routine between them became their own language. He fixed, she fed. He arrived with wood cut to the exact size for her stove without being asked, because he had learned, by observing, that her supply always ran out on Thursdays. She in turn began to save him a piece of freshly baked bread on days when she knew he would work late at the Whitfields' barn, leaving it on his workshop window without knocking on the door, without saying anything, like someone leaving an offering. He always found it. He never mentioned finding it. But the next day, without fail, something on her property had been repaired that she hadn't asked to be repaired. It was, in its purest form, a courtship without the word courtship, a declaration made entirely of actions and silences, because both of them, for reasons neither yet articulated, were too afraid of words. Psychologists call this the language of service acts, a concept that Dr. Gary Chapman developed by studying how people express and receive affection without the need for verbal declarations, and which warns that many of the deepest human connections are built precisely in the space where words still dare not tread. Eleanor didn't talk about marriage. She had decided, years ago, like someone who decides never to touch an instrument again that once broke their fingers. Her mother had died young, worn out by a husband who treated her like just another farm tool. And Eleanor had grown up seeing not love, but survival disguised as devotion in that union. She had built her independence brick by brick, decision by decision, and the mere idea of handing someone else the power to disappoint her was literally, physically intolerable. A weight on her chest that appeared every time some man in town mentioned, with the subtlety of a hammer, that a woman her age should think about settling down. Samuel also didn't talk about marriage, but for a different reason. His incomplete story about a farm in the East wasn't a farm. It was a wedding that never made it to the church. A woman named Clara, who had promised to wait for him while he went to seek land in the West, and who, 18 months later, had written him a 4-line letter announcing she was marrying someone else. Samuel didn't blame Clara. He blamed himself for taking too long, for trusting that time and distance wouldn't change anything when he knew, deep down, that they change everything. He had arrived in Briar Hollow convinced that love was a gamble he had already lost once, and that prudent men don't bet the same hand twice. So for months they settled for nameless closeness, for hot coffee and cut wood, for hands that brushed too long when passing a tool or a loaf of bread, content, or pretending to be content, with an affection that never crossed the line into the spoken word. That spring, however, the balance was broken from outside. A man named Walter Beck arrived, son of the owner of the largest sawmill in the neighboring county, with enough money to buy half of Briar Hollow if he wished, and with the declared intention, from his first week, of finding a wife before summer. He was courteous, he was generous, he offered easy conversation and gifts that didn't hide his purpose. A fine wool shawl for Eleanor on his second visit to the shop, an invitation to dinner on his third. The whole town began to talk. A woman like Eleanor, they said, couldn't afford to refuse such an opportunity forever. The arithmetic of age, which she had managed to ignore for years, suddenly became a constant whisper in every conversation she half heard on the street. Samuel observed all this from a distance he imposed on himself, convinced that he had no right to interfere, convinced that a man without his own land, without fortune, with a history of romantic failure behind him, was no match for Walter Beck in any reasonable sense. He began, without saying it, to space out his visits. The cut wood arrived later. The coffee grew cold without anyone drinking it. Eleanor noticed the absence before she understood what it meant, and when Walter Beck invited her to dinner for the third time, she accepted. Not because she wanted to, but because the alternative, admitting how much she missed Samuel's footsteps on her path, seemed more terrifying than any awkward dinner. On the night of that dinner, as Eleanor fastened the wool shawl she hadn't asked for, she saw Samuel crossing the path toward her house through the window, carrying a basket of late apples, stopping short when he saw the house lights on, when he saw her preparing to leave, and when he finally saw Walter Beck's carriage waiting in front of her door. Samuel didn't knock. He left the basket on the step, in silence, and left. Eleanor found the apples when she returned late that night. The dinner with Walter finished with polite and empty conversation that hadn't managed to fill the space Samuel's absence had left in her chest. She stood on the porch with the basket in her hands, looking at the dark house of his across the prairie, and felt, for the first time with complete clarity, that the silence she had built between them wasn't security. It was a wall she herself had erected, stone by stone, and which now threatened to remain empty of the only man she truly wanted on the other side. 2 weeks passed in which Samuel didn't cross the path once. It was a Thursday, the day he historically delivered wood, when Eleanor ran out of firewood and had to split logs herself in the backyard with an axe she didn't handle skillfully, hitting the edge of her thumb on the second attempt, bleeding onto the dirty snow that hadn't quite melted yet. And it was at that exact moment, kneeling in the mud with her hand burning and her eyes filled with tears that weren't just from physical pain, that she understood something she had been avoiding understanding for years. It wasn't independence she had been protecting all these years. It was fear. Fear disguised as strength. Fear that had given itself the name of self-sufficiency to avoid admitting what it really was. The terror of wanting someone so much that their absence hurt in such a physical way. So much like a broken bone. There is a concept in attachment psychology that researcher John Bowlby formulated when studying how humans form their first affective wounds, and which explains why some people make distance their only form of security. The fear of loss, he said, can be so powerful that humans prefer to have nothing rather than risk losing it. Eleanor sat in the snow until the cold stopped mattering to her, and then, Her hand still wrapped in a blood-stained cloth, she ran towards Samuel's house. She found him in the barn, repairing a wagon wheel that didn't need repairing, occupying his hands with invented work to avoid thinking about what he had seen 2 weeks ago. He looked up when she entered without knocking, just as he had done months earlier in her kitchen, and for a second, neither of them said anything. They just looked at each other in the dusty light that entered through the cracks in the wood. "You cut your finger," he said finally, pointing to the bloody cloth. "It wasn't my finger that hurt," she replied, and her voice trembled in a way she never allowed in public. Samuel put down the tool. He approached slowly, like someone approaching something that might break or run away, and took her injured hand between his, with the same care as that February afternoon. Only this time, he didn't let go after 5 seconds. "Eleanor," he said, and her name and his voice sounded different from how it had ever sounded before. "Why did you have dinner with him?" "Because I was afraid to admit that I prefer to eat dry bread with you than roasted meat with any other man in the county." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that fills itself, slowly, with everything two people have kept quiet for too long. "I've spent months building reasons not to tell you what I feel," Samuel finally said, without letting go of her hand. "I told myself I had nothing to offer you. Land, none. Fortune, none. Just hands that know how to fix things and a heart that once failed to trust quickly enough." "I don't want your land," Eleanor replied. "I don't want your fortune. I've spent years saying no to men who offered exactly that because none of them offered what you offer without knowing it. Presence. Constancy. Coffee that appears warm without me asking for it." "Then tell me directly," he said, "because I've waited so long that I no longer trust my own reading of things." Eleanor took a deep breath, and for the first time in her adult life, she let the truth come out without editing it, without protecting it, without the armor she had worn for a decade. "I love you, Samuel Crane. Not as a comfortable possibility. I love you in the uncomfortable and terrifying way one loves someone when there's no way to pretend it doesn't matter if they leave." He didn't reply with words immediately. He drew her closer, slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. And when she didn't, he kissed her with the honest clumsiness of a man who had rehearsed that moment in his head for months, and who, now that it was truly happening, discovered that no rehearsal had fully prepared him. When they finally separated, it was she who asked, her voice still trembling. "Why had no one proposed to me before you, Samuel? I had opportunities. I rejected them all, yes. But there were also years when no one even tried." Samuel smiled, a slow smile that crossed his entire face before he replied. "Because I was waiting for someone like you," he whispered, and the phrase didn't sound like rehearsed poetry. It sounded like a truth he himself was discovering as he said it. Before continuing, a small pause. "What country are you listening from today? Tell us in the comments, because stories like this cross borders. But the heart that listens to them is always, in any language, the same." What came next was not a hasty wedding or a public declaration with fanfare. It was, like everything between them, built with their hands. Samuel repaired Eleanor's house roof one last time as a neighbor, and for the first time as the man who would soon share that roof. And she taught him, laughing, how to sew a decent button, because, she said, a husband who can fix wagons but not his own shirt is only half a man. Walter Beck, upon hearing the news, left town without scandal, his dignity wounded but intact. And no one ever mentioned him unkindly again. Some even sincerely wished him that he would find elsewhere what he hadn't found in Briar Hollow. The wedding was small, held in Eleanor's orchard under apple trees that were just beginning to bloom, with the whole town as witness to a union that everyone, in retrospect, said they had seen coming since winter. Eleanor wore a dress she had sewn herself, without help, because some independences didn't need to be abandoned, only shared. Samuel built, with his own hands, the table where they would eat every night for the rest of their lives. The life they built together was not a story without friction. There were disagreements about money, about the right way to plant the garden, about how many days a week Samuel should work away from home. But each disagreement ended at the same table he had built, with both their hands seeking each other from underneath it, even in the middle of the argument, silently reminding each other that disagreement was part of shared life, not a threat against it. They had 2 children. They expanded the fabric shop into the place where half the county bought their work clothes. Samuel stopped talking about the farm in the east that never existed as a wound and began to talk about it, occasionally, as a lesson that time had taught him to be grateful for, because without that loss, he would never have come to Briar Hollow. 30 years later, on an autumn afternoon with the light falling golden on the same orchard where they had married, Eleanor, her hair now gray, her hands marked by decades of work, found Samuel sitting on the porch, still repairing something. This time, a child's chair that would soon belong to their first grandchild. She sat beside him without a word, resting her head on his shoulder as she had done 10,000 afternoons before. And he, without looking up from his work, took her free hand and held it exactly as he had held it that first afternoon in the barn, with the same care, as if he still feared she might pull away. "Were you still waiting for someone like me?" she asked, jokingly, after 3 decades together. "Every day," he replied, without hesitation, without needing to invent the answer. "I'm still waiting for you every morning I see you enter the kitchen, as if the wait had never ended. It just became a habit." And perhaps that is the most honest truth love teaches us with time. That waiting for someone and having found them are not 2 distinct stages of the same story, but the same thing repeated every day, with a cup of hot coffee, with a hand seeking another hand under the table, with a roof repaired before anyone had to ask for it. Because in the end, what we all seek is not someone perfect. It is someone who, without ever saying it in grand words, decides to stay. Again and again, in every small choice, waiting for exactly who we are.